What are your thoughts on the racing that we saw this weekend, the Cup package, the Xfinity package, 3 years in, what we've seen compared to what we were seeing in the late 2010s and early 2020s before the reconfiguration?
I mean, compared to what we saw in the 2010s and early 2020s, it's definitely not a thumbs down, in my opinion. But I think if I could put it somewhere between here and here, it's probably a 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, whatever that looks like to you. So, I mean, nearly thumbs completely up for me. Listen, I know me, myself included, did not like that we were turning Atlanta into a super speedway. I thought it was ripping apart something that wasn't broken and trying to make it something that would sell well, which I think it has sold well. I mean, Atlanta crowds seem to be suffering, and that's why you do these sorts of things. Um, I think it has helped our trips there to Atlanta, and it's I mean, you can't argue that it's exciting to watch. I mean, it's put on some good racing here, both in the spring and in the fall. I don't think you can argue against that. Depending on what your idea of good racing is, I thought it was pretty enjoyable. Um, of course, some of the drivers don't love it; some of them really do. But at the same time, the reason it's not completely up for me and it's a 10 is I think now with this car, we've kind of got to the spot where it's really good with mile and a halfs right now, depending on where you go. And so it's like we jump in a way. In hindsight, we kind of jumped the gun on fixing Atlanta into something else. And now this car might be really suitable for old Atlanta, but we'll never be able to figure that out because it's kind of like getting a tattoo, isn't it? Once you reconfigure a track like that, it's going to take a lot of money to go. I mean, it took a lot of money to get it this way, so it's going to be this way for a long time. You better start finding some positives around it because it's going to be here for a while. I mean, you can't just rip it off and go back right now. Maybe in 10, 20 years you could, but yeah, the track's going to have to age, and that might help some of the that might provide some lack of handling. I don't think that's going to do too much, though. It still is working like a speedway, like they intended for it to, and it's very narrow, very like going through a busy hometown street. So there's not a lot of breathing room compared to Talladega, and much less than Daytona as well, which we always associate with little breathing room. I like it. And I know why people don't, and I also fall in that camp for some things, but I'd say love what you got, and I think it's good for what it is.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I hate it. I just would probably say that I hate that we had to lose the old Atlanta to get the new Atlanta. And I was on record. I said here 3 years ago on one of our Grid Live shows, I'd like, look, I think it's time to repave it. I think, when you have a situation where, part of a track is coming up and, it's this extreme. I mean, I get why people, myself included, loved how worn out it was and how, if you had a wreck on the restart, just running the caution laps alone was enough to force everybody back into the pits because they needed new tires. That was how abrasive the surface was and how quickly it wore your tires out. I get that we needed to repave it, but to lose, a configuration that gave us so many memorable moments, although you can make the argument that we already did that in the late 90s or whenever it was that Atlanta went over. I feel like it was 98. Don't quote me on that exactly, but this wasn't the first time.
98, yeah.
Yeah, that wasn't the first time that Atlanta had gone through a reconfiguration, but certainly wasn't one that was this radical in terms of how it was going to change the style of racing we saw. So I don't know. I mean, if they'd done this to Kentucky Speedway, for example, or maybe, no disrespect to the race fans out there, but a track that maybe didn't have as much character or as much history or
History is the big
wasn't
one.
as universally, well liked or received. I mean, in Kentucky, you can certainly argue the opposite, whether it's fans that were still upset from the traffic disaster from the inaugural race or others who simply thought the racing just wasn't as good there. If they had reconfigured that mile and a half into something like this, I don't think there would have been as many broken hearts in the NASCAR community. And, regardless of whether or not you enjoy this, because I think a lot of people do enjoy this. It's just, it comes at the expense of something else that they enjoyed. And that's, I think, where I fall into it here. I still don't love it, but I think that's because I don't love super speedway racing in general. I don't love seeing, the massive accidents, or it's just pack racing. That style just isn't for me as much as it is, long green flag run, and putting it more fully in the hands of a driver. Not to say that there aren't certain drivers that excel at super speedway style racing more so than others. I'm not saying that it takes no skill at all. Don't get me wrong, but it's just it's a style of racing that I've never been as big a fan of as I am at other intermediate tracks. So again, like to your point, of course, the amount of money, the amount of time and resources it took to pull this project off, I think we're going to be stuck with it for at least another 15 years. So fans, if you're on the fence about it, or you're not enjoying what you're seeing here, I think I've got bad news for you. I don't see
Got to
them
get over it and
yeah
find some
changing it
positives.
any sooner than that.
Yeah.
But I think right now we've got, we're going to Atlanta twice, Talladega, Daytona. I mean, fully a sixth of the schedule is now super speedway style pack racing. JJ Yaley out there with NY Racing, God bless them. They were only 3 or 4 seconds off the lead, much of a day, but they were running around in 35th, 36th place, which is, unfortunately, with the limited resources of that team being an open entry with very little sponsorship, that's where you would expect that car to be running. But they were 4 seconds off the lead, because that's what this package allows here. So I get that, people love seeing, those massive packs and those runs and everybody being so close together under a blanket. But I would certainly not be a fan if they did this to, say, a Texas or a Kansas or another mile and a half. I think we absolutely don't need to copy this blueprint just because of the great finish that we got here in the spring. And I think that's another frustrating part for me as well, is that I think the race in the spring had a very good finish. It was kind of bogged down by a very messy, chaotic race in and of itself, but certainly had a fantastic finish at the end. This one certainly had some longer runs, but did get a little messy towards the end there as well, and we had to go into overtime. And even then, the race technically ended under caution. I think Logano had enough of a lead that it didn't matter at that point, but they had to go back and change some of the results to look at when the caution light came on. So it's always frustrating when you go into overtime and the margin of victory still says under caution anyway. But that's not the track's fault. We get that a lot of places that we go. So again, I don't think there's much that we can do about it. Certainly not anytime soon. But I would have to say I may be warming up to this kind of racing a little bit, but it does frustrate me that we lost the old Atlanta because of it.
I do, yeah, I know, and I like to have some faith that NASCAR kind of understands how to make parity of the schedule within reason, which within the resources that they have, and also mixing in with the new opportunities they want to make, like going to Mexico City next year. Yeah, but you make up a great point about Kentucky. Your two super. I just thought about it, your two super speedways in the country are both in the Southeast, or they were historically both in the Southeast, with Alabama and Florida. And making it in Kentucky, I mean, really, it says Kentucky Speedway, but really, it's Cincinnati, Ohio. I mean, it's right there on the dot, on the border. So that actually would have been a really cool what if they went with Kentucky instead of Atlanta on that deal. And but then again, that you can't go back and look at those things, but you can, because it would have made a Midwest super speedway instead
Yeah.
of the three that are now concentrated in the Southeast. So now, as a NASCAR fan, if you want to see a super speedway race, if that is your cup of tea, or you have kids that really enjoy it, or you want them to get that full, I mean, really, come on, the full NASCAR experience. When someone in Europe thinks of a NASCAR or something, they want to see flying past their face front row at Daytona. That's the kind of thing they want to go see. And so, but if you want to see that in America, you have to go to the Southeast. I just imagine those who live in the North, that they got to do some more driving to go come see what they want.
Yeah, it's another good point. I hadn't even thought about that, but they are all very closely geographically located there in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about, but the reality is that we're here now with the new Atlanta, and I think it's here to stay, and that's for better or for worse. It's certainly, whatever you do isn't going to please everybody. And And we'll just leave it there for
Well,
now, I
I
guess.
would add, like, what when was the last classic Atlanta, or Darrell Waltrip's, or his classic Atlanta finish to you on the old configuration? I mean, when
Guess
was the last time we had a really, like, wow, add that to the list of classic Atlanta finishes?
I don't know. I mean, 21 was pretty good because you had, I don't know, Blaney chasing down Larson and Kurt Busch getting help with Chastain to win his one annual race. I mean, we had a pretty good run of that. That was the last year. Maybe I'm just looking at it through rose-colored
Yeah.
glasses, because it was the last time we were going to see it. But yeah, I don't know. And I mean, a counterpoint, I guess, some people would say, well, the Kevin Harvicks of the world were winning races by 14 seconds. I think that was 2018, right?
Yes.
So
I was
this
there
is
for that
probably,
one. Yeah.
yeah, this is probably more competitive than that. I mean, I get it. But the older, I mean, you go back to like, I remember driving home, or I wasn't driving at the time. I was only 12 years old, but coming home from school, listening to the Jimmy Johnson, Jeff Gordon battle on the radio, kills me that I didn't get to see that with visuals the first time I was uh, hearing that commentary and taking that in, because that's a classic finish.
Yeah.
John Bender certainly says, and Alexander, I see your comments as well. We'll get to those in a second. 2001, the best Atlanta finish ever, on the heels of a very similar finish with that same Richard Childress Racing team with Dale Earnhardt and Bobby Labonte in 2000. And then obviously, I mean, this is going back 2 configurations now, but what I still think is in many ways the greatest NASCAR race ever, the 1992 Hooters 500.
Right.
So, it's certainly, but again, that's the playoff argument, right? If you try to create a classic moment every single time you come to the track or every single time you crown a champion, what is a classic moment every time? Well, now it's a classic moment none of the time because you expect it. That's always how it's going to play out. You're always going to have those 4 guys level on points going into the final race. But, under the old system, that's what made 92 Atlanta so special, is because, we don't get what was a fight between the 3 main guys, but really a 6-way fight if you extend it all the way mathematically for a championship, in a thrilling title battle that came down in the very end. You don't get that every year, and that's what is part of what makes that race so legendary. So I guess you can use the same philosophy for the track here. You try to create something that's going to create an exciting, thrilling finish every time. With limited success. Certainly it had success there in the spring, maybe not so much this time, but does that maybe take away from how special those moments are too? It's interesting to think about.
Yeah, I'd say they're definitely a 1 for 2 this year. I mean, I enjoyed this race, but I don't think it was a classic moment. And despite all their efforts to try to manufacture that, it didn't happen that way. We did have overtime to kind of spice things up, and Noah Gregson with the last caution there, but they didn't really. I bet they didn't really get the result they paid for. They intended to happen.
Sure.
We got something a little more organic, just raw speed and Joey Logano.
Yeah, well, Alexander Stiegel says something interesting here. He believes Atlanta would still have pack racing if they repave the surface and didn't reconfigure the track. NASCAR would still bring this package, and the surface still has the mechanical grip or max grip. I'm not sure there, but that's an interesting theory there. But I don't know if they hadn't. What if they had left the banking and configuration the way it was, but brought the super speedway style package here? What kind of racing would we have seen? Obviously, they reconfigured the track to take advantage of the package, but that is an interesting theory. If you just give it a new smooth surface, it was known as one of the fastest tracks in the sport, fastest mile and a half in the sport, and it's interesting to think about for sure.